The Passion of Adam and Eve, the world's first lovers. The adultery of the notorious sins of Sodom and Gomorrah. The sacred physical attraction between man and wife. Biblical commandments regarding love, sexual intercourse, incest, divorce, and homosexuality have shaped our attitudes about love and sex for more than 3,000 years. And yet, most of us would be surprised to discover the truth about how the Hebrew Bible views sex.
People are always shocked about all the things they find in the Bible that they didn't hear in Sunday school or at synagogue. The Bible can be very steamy. It reads almost like an ancient Israelite love manual. It is very frank. It is very graphic in its descriptions of physical love. How on earth does this kind of work get to be scripture?
The pages of the Holy Bible are full to overflowing with tales of love and desire. Why does this most sacred book have so much explicit sexuality in it? Join us as we explore the mysteries of the Bible.
Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply." Genesis 1:27.
Into a world of wonder, God placed man and woman, Adam and Eve. They lived in a magical garden called Eden. In the Hebrew Bible, human history begins with the creation of this pair, the first husband and wife. God's first commandment to them is to procreate. Perhaps first and foremost, the Bible has been regarded as a guide to living a virtuous life. And yet, surprisingly, this sacred work contains startling stories of eroticism and passion. The pages of the Bible offer an unflinching look at even the most intimate aspects of human sexuality.
The Bible is a portrait of human life. And if sex were not a part of it, people would look at it and say, well, look, they're lovely stories and they're very nice, but they don't bear a mirror up to the world that I know. And because the Bible is intended to instruct us about what this world is like, it is filled with all the same conflicting passions, emotions, tragedies, and triumphs as our world.
From the first chapters of the Bible, we are introduced to the joys, tragedies, and mysteries of marriage. Surprisingly, one of the Bible's first images is deeply sexual. The Bible relates that man and wife, Adam and Eve, become one flesh. Then, as if to tempt them, God tells them of the tree of knowledge in the center of the garden.
And the Lord God commanded the man, "You may eat freely of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat." Genesis 2:15.
But Eve is not only tempted by God, she is beguiled by a snake. Intriguingly, many of the images in the story of Adam and Eve are tinged with the erotic.
There are strong sexual overtones in the whole creation story. Eve is created out of Adam's body. God uses Adam's rib in order to create Eve, and from a Freudian perspective, this is a phallic symbol. The serpent itself is a phallic symbol.
Did the ancient Hebrews view sex differently than the pagan cultures surrounding them in Canaan? Or did the Hebrews actually borrow ideas from them? As presented in the Bible, Eve is the perfect mother. But was Eve actually the first woman? Studying the Bible, rabbis made a surprising discovery in the book of Genesis. For they noticed another woman is mentioned before Eve is created from Adam's rib in the Garden of Eden.
Male and female he created them. Genesis 1:27.
To resolve the discrepancy, medieval rabbis looked to an age-old myth from Sumer and Babylon. They declared that Adam's first wife corresponded to an irresistible night-flying demoness that the legends called Lilith.
She's a succubus. She enters in through windows and she sits on men's faces and she excites them to all sorts of nocturnal dreams and wild orgy-like behavior. She is the power of female sexuality untamed.
The rabbis, who of course were men, projected their lust onto the archetype of Lilith, and she became the great seducer.
The rabbis even suggested that sexual incompatibility was the reason Lilith left Adam.
Some of us like to think of Lilith as the first feminist. She has a difficult relationship with Adam. They come together to engage in the sexual act, and Adam has every intention of being on top. Lilith sees no reason why this should be so. She was made from the ground, just like Adam was. She's an equal partner, and she refuses. When Adam tries to force her in an act of marital rape, she says the secret name of God and disappears in a flash. Henceforth, she will now prowl the deserts and look for lone men to incite to sexual misbehavior. So Lilith not only represents the first marriage, but the first divorce.
From the strange sexual powers of Lilith to the 700 concubines of King Solomon, the Bible seems almost as driven by passion and lust as by spiritual belief. When we return, surprising evidence of how the Bible guarantees women the right to sexual fulfillment.
Mysteries of the Bible will return in a moment. Rejoice in the wife of your youth. May her breasts satisfy you at all times. May you be intoxicated always by her love. Proverbs 5:19.
In the Hebrew Bible, marriage, like sexuality, is a gift from God, the Creator. But did romantic love, as we think of it today, play a part in the marriages of ancient Israel? Does the Bible envision love as an essential ingredient in a successful marriage? One example of a marriage characterized in the Bible as ideal was apparently not based on love at all. The marriage of Isaac and Rebekah was arranged by their parents. Until their wedding day, they had never set eyes on one another.
It was not uncommon in the ancient world to marry someone and then come to love them, because marriage was so much of a social contract. It was so much about the building blocks of society. It was so much about producing children who would grow up to carry on the tradition, that love was considered by many a wonderful but not indispensable accompaniment of a marriage.
In a religion supposedly devoted to monogamy, it is surprising that of all the first families of the Bible, Isaac is the only patriarch who does not practice polygamy. But how many wives is a man allowed to have? King Solomon had 300 wives and 700 concubines.
Solomon is certainly the one person in the Bible who might be thought of as having the most sexual activity, because he's got hundreds of wives and concubines, and of course he is responsible for their sexual satisfaction. However, if you grant Solomon, say, a 12-hour day trying to service 1,000 women, that works out to something like 6 seconds a bride. And I can't imagine that the women in Solomon's harem were particularly thrilled with their lot in life.
In this male-oriented society, it is perhaps surprising that women were allowed definite sexual rights. The rabbis went so far as to guarantee every married woman the right to regular sex, explicitly for her own pleasure.
In fact, they made a series of requirements for how often a man must have sex with his wife in order to give her a kind of minimal sexual satisfaction. And these requirements in the Talmud, which are stated in the Talmud, are based on a man's occupation. If you're a sailor and you're not home very often, you're only required to sleep with her once every 6 months. If you're a scholar who tend to be home pretty often, then at least once a week. If you're unemployed, then the requirement is every day.
Ironically, although adultery was forbidden, men were allowed to have sex with other women. For if a wife was unable to bear children, it was acceptable for her to give a concubine to her husband, to be used as a surrogate mother. Were these concubines similar to modern-day prostitutes?
Biblical concubines should not be viewed in the standard Western mode as something like a mistress or a woman who is just there to be sexually exploited. Biblical concubines are actually co-wives. They bear children to their husband, and they should be viewed as true wives, not as party girls.
The drama of the barren woman is at the heart of perhaps the greatest love story in the Bible. It is the story of Jacob and his 2 wives, Rachel and Leah.
Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel." Genesis 29:16.
Although Jacob had fallen in love with Rachel, he is tricked into marrying her sister, Leah. Their father tells Jacob he must work another 7 years in order to be able to marry Rachel as well. But ironically, Rachel is barren, while her sister Leah produces one child after another.
It's really interesting that the Bible does have these very two extremely opposite ways of portraying love. One based on having children, one based on just passion and lust just by itself.
When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister, and she said to Jacob, "Give me children, or I shall die." Genesis 30:1.
Rachel tries everything to bear a child for Jacob. She even uses an ancient version of a fertility drug, an organic aphrodisiac, the mandrake root. After all her suffering, God hears Rachel's torment and answers her prayers. But tragically, she dies in childbirth.
It seems as though for Jacob, Leah is the home builder and Rachel is the great romantic love. And even in Rachel's early dying, she follows the paradigm of great romantic love, because romantic love isn't full unless it's tragic.
Even the deepest passion of a great hero of faith like Jacob can end in tragedy. But perhaps the story's true meaning is to reveal to us how important love really is.
The lovers in the Bible are real. They challenge us to fall in love with real human beings who are flawed and scared and vulnerable and difficult, all the things that we are too. And the one lesson that we could draw from the Bible, if we were wise enough, is not just that love is beautiful, but that love is difficult. And to really love somebody over a lifetime takes a deep commitment. But there is nothing more beautiful in God's world.
When we return, the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah. A biblical hero offers his virgin daughters to a rampaging mob set on rape. Mysteries of the Bible will be right back.
Thou shalt not commit adultery. Exodus 20:14.
While many passages in the Bible truly value the pleasures of physical love and celebrate it joyously, the Bible also contains dire warnings regarding the sexual act if it is divorced from love and marriage. But what was the biblical view on what today we might call casual sex?
According to classical Jewish law in ancient times, if you had sex as two unmarried people, you were betrothed. And that was in part to protect the woman. Because obviously, biologically, the man has less investment in sex than the woman does, and it was to ensure that a seducer wouldn't have sex with a string of women and just leave them.
The Bible also warns about the consequences of sexual relations outside of marriage. It even goes so far as to make a distinction between having sex with a prostitute and having sex with another man's wife.
Preserve you from the wife of another, from the smooth tongue of the adulteress. Do not desire her beauty in your heart, for a prostitute's fee is only a loaf of bread, but the wife of another stalks a man's very life. Proverbs 6:24.
The idea of limiting sexuality to marriage has a lot to do with the transmission of property from one generation to the next. So a man needed to be sure that his wife was pregnant with his child and not with someone else's child. So the regulations forbidding adultery are very powerful. And both the male and the female are guilty in the same way.
The terrible punishment for those caught in adultery was death by stoning. In the case of rape, if the victim was engaged, the criminal was condemned to death. In other cases, the offender was required to marry his victim and was never granted a divorce. Since a woman was a valuable possession in the ancient world, rape was considered a crime against the woman's father or husband. But biblical laws highlighted the victim's rights as well, both to monetary compensation and the recovery of dignity.
The fact that the Bible is a sacred text today in Judaism and Christianity somehow makes us think that the people that lived in biblical times were more God-fearing, more moral, or something like that. Nonsense. No people on earth has ever managed to achieve a society that was free of difficulties in terms of violence that one human being perpetrates upon another.
Strangely, though the Bible comments on every sexual scenario, lesbianism is not mentioned at all. But there were some sexual practices which were especially forbidden. To the writers of the Bible, homosexuality among men was considered an abomination. Like adultery, it was to be punished by death. But could there be another reason to abhor homosexuality aside from its sexual connotations?
The church and synagogue usually tend to interpret sexual laws in the Bible as being totally moral in content. But in fact, if we set them in ancient context, we find there's a bit more going on. There is a real desire to repress any practices that have to do with foreign worship of the goddess. And in particular, male transvestism and some sorts of homosexual behavior among males were associated with goddess worship. So that's the reason why those things are wrong.
Perhaps no story has been used more to condemn homosexuality than the biblical account of Sodom and Gomorrah. In fact, the term sodomy originates from the legendary town of Sodom. Sodom and Gomorrah are considered evil by God and are marked for destruction. But mercifully, he sends two angels disguised as men to warn Lot, the nephew of the patriarch Abraham. Lot gives the angels shelter for the night. It is then that the horror begins.
The men of Sodom surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, so that we may know them." Genesis 19:5.
The people converge upon the house and say, send out your guests. We want to sodomize them. We want to know them, which is biblical for, or connotes they want to have sex with them.
Rather than surrender his guests to the wild mob bent on rape, Lot tries to calm them by making an offer that seems horrendous.
"I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have two daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. Genesis 19:7.
Lot's willingness to sacrifice his daughters, essentially, to this mob seems to me a terrible perversion of what is a good trait, and that is the classic Middle Eastern trait of hospitality. If someone comes under your roof, you protect them by any means.
Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and everyone living there. Genesis 19:23.
Lot's story doesn't end there. It leads to another sin, incest. After the horrendous destruction sent down by God, Lot's daughters believe they and their father are the only people left on earth, and they devise a plan to perpetuate the human race.
Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him. Genesis 19:31.
From the women's point of view in the Hebrew Bible, they are eager to bear children. They will do whatever it takes. If it's Lot's daughters thinking they're the last people on earth and realizing that if they want to have children, they have to sleep with their father, they'll get him drunk and do it. This was a woman's quest. Men hope to achieve honor in battle. Women achieve honor by giving birth.
The Hebrew Bible's attitude towards adultery, rape, and even homosexuality may have less to do with sex itself than we might suppose. The perpetuation of the race was all important. So important that it seems biblical writers might endorse any means to ensure the survival of the Jewish people. When we return, adultery, murder, and rape destroy the realm of King David.
Mysteries of the Bible will return in a moment.
In the Hebrew Bible, sex is not separated from the real world, but is intimately connected to it. For in the ancient world, as in our own, sex and politics were inextricably interwoven. Nowhere is this more strikingly revealed than in the biblical story of King David. His is a tale of political intrigue spiced with adultery, rape, murder, and incest, which offers a revealing glimpse of the role of sexual politics in the time of the Bible. King David carved out an empire unmatched in the history of ancient Israel. From his beginnings as a court musician and poet, to his stunning victory over the giant Goliath, to his meteoric rise from military commander to king, David seems like the ideal biblical hero. But there was another, darker dimension to the legendary monarch.
David is a terrible father. He's a terrible husband. And he is someone that it's almost impossible to understand as the ideal king, and yet the Bible does.
One evening, David went for a stroll on the roof of the palace. As he looked out over the city, he noticed a woman of unusual beauty taking her evening bath. He sent to find out who she was, and was told she was Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah. Then David sent for her, and when she came, he slept with her. 2 Samuel 11:2.
He may have known perfectly well that you can't take the wife of another man. Bathsheba was married, but he has to have her. He brings Bathsheba to the palace and has sex with her, and she ultimately becomes pregnant.
Why, seemingly without regret or fear of retribution, does David impulsively violate God's commandment not to commit adultery? Were the writers of the Bible trying to convey a deeper message?
The Bible tells us that sexuality is one of the most powerful forces in the world. It makes its appearance in the very first pages of Genesis, and we find it throughout the Bible. Humans will love each other, whether it's good for them or not.
In the Jerusalem of ancient times, as in the Washington of modern times, it seems that concealing the truth about sexual escapades was essential to keeping political power. When David learns that Bathsheba is pregnant, he embarks on a massive intrigue designed to save his reputation and keep Bathsheba in his bed. David gives her husband Uriah a message to carry to his commander at the front lines. But the letter Uriah delivers carries his own death sentence.
David is a criminal. By all of the legal regulations that we know from the Bible, David is an adulterer and he's a murderer, and God knows it. There is a curse on David's house.
Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do evil in his sight? Thus saith the Lord, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house. 2 Samuel 12:9.
Mysteriously, instead of his being punished directly, it is King David's family that suffers. For behind the closed doors of the royal palace, a story of incestuous rape is about to unfold. David's son rapes his own half-sister, Tamar.
He took hold of her and said to her, Come lie with me, my sister. She answered him, No, my brother, do not force me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. But he would not listen to her, and being stronger than she, he forced her and lay with her. 2 Samuel 13:13.
God's curse does not stop with the rape of Tamar. Now violence begets violence within the royal family. Tamar's younger brother, Absalom, enraged over the savage attack, kills the rapist, his own brother. Absalom now challenges King David himself and drives the monarch from the city. Then, in one of the most shocking events in the Bible, he rapes his father's wives.
The sexual scandals of David's court would be at home on any tabloid page and in any television soap opera. It's a nasty, dysfunctional family that we're seeing living in the palace in Jerusalem.
But why is this lurid and violent tale in the Bible? And the question remains whether David was punished adequately for his sexual transgressions.
David commits great sins and suffers greatly for them. Whether he suffers as much as he ought is a difficult moral calculus. Some would say yes, some would say no. But I don't think he gets away with his crimes. His child dies. His son rebels against him. The end of his kingship is turbulent. And for all of his achievements, in the end, God tells him, David, you have blood on your hands.
Scholars have been fascinated that this story of sex and politics in a male-dominated world may actually be making a point about women.
The lesson we're being taught here is that women's bodies are sacred symbols. They are not just pawns in men's politics, but they are symbols of life and joy and the continuation of the community. When a woman's body is violated, God's laws are violated and the whole community suffers.
David's sexual appetite for Bathsheba led him to adultery and murder. But ironically, it was through this union, begun in sin, that Bathsheba gives birth to a child who would become Israel's greatest king, Solomon.
The fact that a child is born of an adulterous union doesn't mean that the child isn't favored by God. Solomon, who is the product of the union between David and Bathsheba, becomes a favored king of God. And in some ways, that tells us that from the most unpromising soil, sometimes great things bloom. And that is, after all, part of the message of the Bible.
The sexual politics of David's scandal-ridden court resonates through history into our own times. It is a message that endures to this day. Whether a king or a commoner, in sexual sin as in other kinds, all of us are to be judged equally. When we return, why do the pages of the Bible contain one of the most explicit erotic love poems ever written?
Mysteries of the Bible will return in a moment. And he said to her, O loved one, delectable maiden, you are stately as a palm tree, and your breasts are like its clusters. Oh, may your breasts be like clusters of the vine, and the scent of your breath like apples, and your kisses like the best wine. Song of Solomon 7:7.
The Song of Solomon, also known as the Song of Songs, is perhaps the most sensual and provocative book in the Hebrew Bible. A dialogue between a young maiden and her sweetheart as they revel in the intoxicating pleasures of love and sex. What is the Bible telling us about human sexuality?
When you begin to look at the Hebrew of the song, you can understand why the rabbis and monks were busy fanning themselves as they read and translated this stuff, because it's pretty hot.
And he said to her, your breasts are two fawns, twins of a gazelle. Your belly is a mound of wheat, edged with lilies. Your navel is the moon's drinking cup. May it brim with wine. Song of Solomon 7:2.
The man says to his lover that her navel is like a goblet filled with wine. And yet, when we look at this word for navel, it probably is referring to a piece of her anatomy that's a little bit lower than her belly button.
The explicit sexual nature of the Song of Solomon has troubled biblical scholars for centuries. How is the Song of Solomon accepted into the canon of Holy Scripture?
Even as late as the 2nd century CE, there was a debate among the rabbis about whether or not the Song of Songs should be included in the Bible. Then Rabbi Akiba, who was one of the greatest and most respected of all the rabbis, explained to the other rabbis that it really wasn't an erotic love poem, that instead it was an allegory of the love between God and Israel.
And then when Christians came along, they changed it, and they said, this is really about Christ's love for the church. So we've gone in every direction trying to make this not be about sex, when any teenager reading the Song of Songs can tell you exactly what this text is about.
My beloved thrust his hand into the opening, and the core of my being trembled on account of him. I rose to open to my lover, with my hands dripping with myrrh, my fingers flowing myrrh upon the handles of the bolt. Song of Solomon 5:4.
Is the Song of Solomon about God's love for Israel, or Jesus' love for the church? The song has been likened to a lock for which the key has been lost. But perhaps the secret to understanding the song is to accept it for exactly what it seems. A voluptuous poem that joyously celebrates physical love. The question remains, should it be in the Bible?
For some, it is a great mystery why the book, the Song of Songs, is in the Bible. To me, it seems no mystery at all, because what belongs better in the book of God's world than God's greatest gift, which is a love between a man and a woman?
Perhaps, instead of being at odds with spirituality, the sexuality in the Bible is its most intense expression. The Bible is not only a mirror of life. It glorifies and sanctifies the passion from which all life springs. For like Adam and Eve, only in the act of love can a man and woman become one flesh.
Set me as a seal upon your heart, for love is strong as death, passion fierce as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, a raging flame. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it. Song of Solomon 8:6.
Of all the books of the Bible, it would be hard to find a book more relevant today than the Song of Songs. It tells us that love is powerful. In the song, one person doesn't rule over another. They are equal in love. Love is about partnership. Romance is about mystery. And God is all about love.
Every moment, every milestone of every personality. For 20 years, Biography has left conjecture and innuendo to the other shows. You know, the ones that come and go. Biography, Monday through Saturday at 8 on the Biography Channel, where everyone has a story.